Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I'm Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Shaka Extra Time is Shaka Sally himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka. How are you?
Hello, Paul.
Good to see you again.
Well, I have to say that I'm hugely terrific this time around.
And a warm welcome to all our Facebook followers watching us live from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask Shaka some questions about the politics, the issues, anything that is of particular concern to you. So Shaka, let us start in Kenya. There is so much happening in Kenya. The general election is scheduled to take place on August 8th, 2017. Voters once again will be excited to see the key major players tussling out each other. That is President Uhuru Kenyatta and his political arch-rival Raila Odinga. Your thoughts?
Very interesting. Of course, we should not forget the fact that there are several other political leaders who are also trying to win State House Nairobi, even though, to be politically perhaps realistic, we are probably on firm ground, and should be safe to say that as in the previous 3 or 4 different types of elections, it is increasingly, of course, looking once again as a two-horse race between those two key principles that you mentioned. And everything on the ground, frankly, indicates that it is very interesting. It's beginning, in fact, to look like a real electoral process.
Some publication just came out with a survey that shows that those two candidates are almost neck to neck, with, of course, the exception of a margin of error of about 4 percentage points. What does this say about President Uhuru's incumbency? Should he be scared that Raila Odinga might snitch this away from him?
I think if I were in the shoes of President Uhuru Kenyatta, I don't think, frankly, that I would be very much encouraged by the types of statistics that you're talking about. Because, first of all, he came in ahead at 48%, meaning that if the election were to be held today, he would win. But he would fall short of the magic number, which is 50 plus 1 vote, in which case it would be going to the second round. Raila Odinga, on the other hand, someone is from the opposition, frankly, not to have any major record to stand on because he's not an incumbent. He comes in at 42. I think that is something that he needs to feel comfortable with. And then, of course, you're talking about the fact that they found that 71%, or more than 71%, are not optimistic about where their country is headed. They have also they looked at the those who support the opposition. More than 90% of those who were interviewed, they feel like the country is on the wrong track. And then you have the issue, of course, of corruption. That's almost like an elephant in the room, really. I don't know how, if you're an incumbent, you can negotiate that.
But in fairness to that, a lot of people would say under President Uhuru Kenyatta's leadership, Kenya has gone through some interesting times, but they have also concentrated on infrastructure development. For example, he's about to inaugurate the standard gauge railway, where they spent about almost $3.5 billion.
Well, of course, they didn't quite just spend it, they borrowed it. It is borrowed money. It is also a project that, in a sense, for some people, it symbolizes a major scandal. We're talking about corruption here because, in fact, there are some people who have said that if you compared, for example, the railway project from Mombasa to Nairobi and compare with the other Chinese projects in Tanzania and Ethiopia, that frankly, you couldn't possibly justify the figures that is coming out of Nairobi. Now, having said that, we should obviously give credit to where it belongs. I think that Kenyatta did a great job because this is the first major infrastructure project that has actually taken place, probably in the entire East African region. You understand that there used to be a railway, which was called, in fact, the Uganda Railway, which started out of Mombasa and ends in Kasese, Western Uganda. This was started in 1896, and it was completed in 1929. There are more than 2,000 people that died along the way during the construction. In fact,
man-eaters and all that stuff.
Yeah, you've seen those types of films. In fact, the line was dubbed as the Lunatic Express, or the Lunatic Line, because it caused a lot of damage. But let's face it, at the end of the day, it sincerely became a major, if not a huge, economic and strategically vital for both Kenya and Uganda.
There are some analysts who say that the outcome of this election in Kenya, pitting President Uhuru Kenyatta against former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, who, by the way, has failed three times, that this could be the time he actually makes it to State House Nairobi.
Not only could it be the time, but I think we should also point out the fact that there is a lot of evidence, sincerely, which suggests that the last two elections, the last one being the 2013 and the one of 2007, which caused mayhem, as you remember, these were not, in fact, elections. These were state strategic projects, whose results, frankly, did not necessarily reflect the people who actually went to the vote, but rather the numbers at the end of the day were reflections of who had the power to announce the results. And it happened to be the state of Kenya. And now it's a question of who controlled it at that time.
In fact, you remind me of a greater saying by Joseph Stalin, who said it doesn't matter who counts the vote. Right, it doesn't matter how many people show up to vote, but what matters is who counts the vote. That's a perfect segue for us to go to Rwanda. Obviously, in Rwanda, that saying could not be further from the truth. When you talk about who they're having elections, August 4th, 4 days before the Kenyan election, and there's no opinion poll to judge by what is going to happen in Rwanda. But most political analysts who are observing the Rwanda situation, they say there's not going to be an election because we already know who is going to count the vote. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think those types of pundits or observers and what have you wouldn't probably be very far away from getting it right, because let's face it, you know as well as I do that last year there was a referendum, so to speak, which was overwhelmingly supported by the majority of the people, really. And we were told that there were only 10 people, if I remember correctly, that were of the opposing view. Now, if you, in fact, even if you had an opportunity to have a semblance of election, are you telling me that you can persuade more than 10 people to decide to vote for someone else other than the incumbent president, Major General Paul Kagame? Let's face it, you don't even have a semblance of an independent media in Rwanda, unlike, say, what you have in Kenya, even though the traditional media, to be very honest with you, is largely controlled by Kenyatta and his supporters and his allies. I am talking about the Nation Media Group, which is owned largely by the Aga Khan, but largely controlled probably what they call the Chiambu Mafia or that kind of stuff. We're talking about television, newspapers, we're talking about radios and all that kind of stuff. And when you look to the other major traditional media, the Standard Media Group is basically largely controlled by former Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi and his his supporters. And those two politically happen to be on the same page. And then you have, for example, Capital Radio, controlled by one of the richest Kenyan, tycoons, Chris Kirubi. And then you have SK Macharia, the Royal Media, which obviously carries Citizen Television and so many radio stations. These come from essentially the Central Province. And for most political pundits think that these obviously would support the incumbent. Not to mention that the Kenyatta family itself has actually interest in television, K24. They have Kameme radio station, which broadcasts in the indigenous Kikuyu, and they have a lot of other interests. And yet, when you go to the opposition, people like Raila and his supporters and what have you, frankly, don't seem to reflect anywhere on the radar when it comes to the media. They have some localized radio stations, maybe in Kisumu and what have you, but certainly not a major traditional media group to be campaigning for them, except that they have a chance because of social media, the proliferation of social media, and of course the changing demographics, which makes it look like a new ball game in town, because a lot of those young people are not invested in the status quo. They are looking for jobs, so they probably would lean towards change. But when we go to Kigali, it's a totally different ball game. The only person, in fact, you hear about is incumbent president Paul Kagame and his RPF. You don't even know about the others, frankly, who claim or say that they are actually going to support, to oppose him.
But in fairness to the Rwandan situation, the referendum that was carried out in 2015 approved the constitutional mandate that allows President Paul Kagame to stay in power until the end of 2017. But
even beyond that.
Even beyond that.
As a matter of fact, it personalizes the specific name of Major General Paul Kagame retired, which means, frankly, it even no longer becomes what you would call a constitution. It, in fact, becomes a sort of personal manifesto, not a constitution, really.
So, real quickly, so if you had to compare the two elections, they are both in East Africa. These are two East African countries. You could argue that they are both emerging economies. One is doing better than the other. But on paper, Rwanda seems to be doing very well because of Kagame's leadership. And you look at Kenya, you have so many good things happening in Kenya. When it comes to infrastructure, Kenya, of course, cannot compete with any country in the East African region. But then you have two political playing fields. In Kenya, it seems more of a universal suffrage, more people are engaged. In Rwanda, it's a one-man show. How would you compare the two?
Very interesting. In fact, in Kenya, we also need to talk about the fact that they have undergone and probably still undergoing a bit of drought. And that, in a way, has caused a lot of harm in terms of the economy, in terms of agricultural output and what have you. And in fact, there is a word in town, in Nairobi, they are talking about the possibility of what they characterize as unga revolution. We're talking about the basic staple, unga, which is maize flour or corn bread or whatever. It has, for the last several months, been inaccessible. It's been very, very expensive. And of course, the average person, frankly, in Kenya, you have to talk about unga, ugari, and sukuma wiki, which is like a type of delicious vegetable, which would be called here, I think, collard greens. Collard greens, that is sukuma wiki. And then, of course, milk, the almighty milk, also is a problem because it costs actually slightly more than, in fact, what you need to buy petrol or gasoline, or that kind of stuff. And of course, you know the GNP of Kenya and what have you. There are not so many people who are very rich.
The president can donate some milk because he runs the biggest dairy farm in Kenya, correct?
Are you trying to campaign for him? But when it comes to Rwanda, as you say, frankly, again, you're probably talking about a state-controlled election. Because in fairness to the system of Rwanda, you have the president who operates an imperial presidency. He's a sort of presidential monarch, really, some would say, because he has the power, for example, to appoint the Electoral Commission. He has the power in other words, to influence the outcome, really. It's like imagining having a football field, for example, and you have two teams which are coming to play, and one of the two players has the power to name the referee, the linesmen, and probably the spectators. Would you really be in doubt as to how the game would end?
Absolutely not. On that note, let's go to the comments. Let us start with Mojisha Richard. He says, Mr. Shaka, what is the difference between democracy and development? Which one does Africa need first? Because the two cannot take place at the same time.
Actually, I have news for my brother that the two, frankly, are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, mutually reinforcing. In other words, it's a question of how you define democracy. Abraham Lincoln described it as a government of the people. And I'm talking about a great American president who presided over the war in the United States in the 1860s. He talked about democracy being a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And of course, there is also another great man, a great man by the name Winston Churchill, who used to be a great journalist in his own right, and also became Britain's Second World War's great prime minister, occupying number 10 Downing Street. He talked about democracy perhaps being the worst form of government, except for all the others that we have at that time, of course. When you compare democracy in his view with, say, what was practiced in the Soviet Union, which was communism, what was practiced in Peking, before it was called Beijing, which was also something akin to socialism or communism and what have you. And if you looked at what was happening in Cuba, Havana, and what have you, that kind of stuff, he would tell you democracy at the end of the day, there was no doubt in his mind that it was the best.
Has it changed? It's still the best.
Well, it has changed in the sense that you do have some variations in democracy. You have, for example, social democracy in what is traditionally known as Nordic countries. We're talking about Sweden, we're talking about Norway, we're talking about Denmark, Finland, and you could also add the Netherlands, you know, in that camp. And frankly, when you think about it and you look at the yearly published UNDP Development Index, you find that those countries that I mentioned, they occupy pretty much the top 5 in the world. In fact, there are times even where you find that Cuba, it counts much higher than the United States when it comes to things like education, things like healthcare and all that kind of stuff.
Life expectancy?
Yeah, well, life expectancy, they are somewhere there and what have you. But let's face it, at the end of the day, I think social democracy is probably the key, because it pretty much puts the human being at the center. The policies are people-centered, not structure or not infrastructure-centered. Because if you were to ask me, if you had two options, when you think about development, what would you have to go with? Is it infrastructure or education? There are people who think you should go with infrastructure. But frankly, for me, I would go with those who say education, education, education. Because at the end of the day, it is those educated people, especially when they have quality education, that accesses them to skills. They are the types of people who decide what type of infrastructure they think is best suited for their development needs. When people talk about development sometimes, they really are talking about perhaps economic growth, having sometimes physical infrastructure kind of presence, like cities, very clean cities, like they talk about Kigali and what have you, sometimes skyscrapers like you have in New York. And yet you have many people, for example, in New York who are homeless. So when you talk about the development, you have to be thinking about, is there adequate or sufficient service delivery? And if there is adequate service delivery, meaning people have unfettered access to education, people have unfettered access to health care, people really believe that they have hope tomorrow if they can work very hard and they are very disciplined and they can pay taxes and all that kind of stuff. And their government is responsive and accountable. And then you have to have freedom of expression. There is no substitute. When you're talking about the difference of democracy and development, there is no substitute for people to have civil liberties. People need to be comfortable to think about who they are and where they are going. So as some key president in the United States once said, and that was Barack Obama, that even with prosperity, without freedoms, and we're talking about freedom of expression here, freedom of the press or the media, freedom of association, freedom of worship, and all other types of freedoms. Without that, he said, it is a form of fundamental poverty. I couldn't agree with him more.
Likewise. Let's go to another comment. Dirichi Landiri, Shaka, I'm here in South Sudan. What could be the possible way to achieve a lasting peace in my beloved country? And what should be done to account for the dead since the outbreak of the civil war in 2013?
It is very unfortunate that that question is sincerely seems to basically come, every week. I think we talk about South Sudan, and obviously it is a very legitimate question, and it requires some kind of a legitimate answer. Unfortunately, frankly, I do not think that I have the legitimate answer to that legitimate question, except that I can pretty much say what I have said before. First and foremost, there is a need sincerely for the leaders of South Sudan, whether those are in government or in opposition, to look themselves in the mirror and see whether they like what they see. Because at the end of the day, they can talk the talk, but without walking the talk, while their people are dying, nobody is going to believe in them, or nobody is even going to think, frankly, that they have what it takes to be leaders that they claim to be. I think that they need to be very politically realistic, and frankly, they need the presence of the political will. They need the presence of the political will. They need to make very hard decisions. They also need to know, and I'm addressing this to the president, Salva Kiir Mayardit, at one time my friend. I am trying to tell him, frankly, that there is no shortcut here. He should not try to negotiate around the elephant in the room, because the elephant in the room is a Dr. Riek Machar, who happens to be in the SPLM in opposition. He's going to have to figure out a way of swallowing his pride. And in the interest of all the Southern Sudanese, or the Dinka community, which some say he represents and reflects, he is going to have to cut a deal with this man and his supporters. Because at the end of the day, Paul, you do not make peace with your friends. You actually make peace with your adversaries, with your enemies. I think there are no shortcuts here.
Interesting. Let's go to another comment. He says, Muzei Nyabyondo Vista Samuhirwe. Shaka, why is this word retirement giving a headache to our African leaders?
I don't know, Mr. Muhirwe, whether it is giving them a headache, because it seems to be something really obvious. I can see that when it comes to different professions, it's not difficult for a teacher, for example, of teaching for 4 decades, to retire from teaching. People like Muzei Boniface Byanyima of Ruti, a suburb of Mbarara, Western Uganda, who is going to be a subject for tomorrow's Straight Talk Africa. We're going to look at his profile, reflecting on his legacy. He was a great teacher at Mbarara High School, became a head teacher, retired from that, went into politics, became a great member of parliament. It reached a point, of course, where there was no politics to talk about because a General Idi Amin stepped in place and decided to ban politics and what have you. And the old man retired to his rooty home. And he did other things. He became a rancher and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to doctors, I see doctors serving for 30 years or 40 years. They retire. When it comes to even farmers sometimes, actually, they retire. When it comes to artists, musicians, footballers and what have you, they retire. The only people where I have found problems not finding it perhaps in their DNA to retire are people who are presidents, and especially those who came to power through AK-47, who seized power in military fatigues and eventually declared themselves Democrats and start putting on some very expensive, beautiful Italian suits. So it's up to them. Why do they do that? Perhaps because they feel insecure because of some of the policies they have carried out. So they feel insecure that they can't possibly live in retirement without the big thing called political immunity.
Very briefly, there is a comment here from Alice Mary Kebirungi. Do you think President Zuma of South Africa deserves a vote of no confidence?
Well, Alice, I don't think, frankly, that is where, I should go because, let's face it, that is up to the members of the ruling African National Congress and especially the National Executive Committee, which met from Friday up to Sunday, I think, or Monday, and decided that, you know what, they still have confidence in the man.
Well, Shaka, on that note, thank you so much for being another great interviewee.
You're most welcome, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hugely terrific.
Yeah.